Okay, it looks like we're live, so welcome everybody. I just wanted to make a quick video about dating. Now, not dating as in relationships. That's a topic in modern Christianity I have no intention at this point of throwing my hat into the ring regarding. But what I wanted to talk with you about was how we know how an old how old an ancient manuscript is. A lot of you may be aware about the debacle of the first century Mark fragment that was talked about for like a decade. And I have a long blog post titled First Century Mark Fragments and Figments of Our Imagination, where I tackled the history of all that nonsense in particular. And you can find that at wesleyhuff.com. But long story short, it wasn't a manuscript from the first century. It wasn't even a new manuscript, it turns out. It was a papyrus fragment that we'd had the whole time from a group of important documents named after the place they're from, Oxyrhynchus, which is also a really great word to say. And that's a place in Egypt. And this particular manuscript from the Oxyrhynchus collection was dated to the 4th century. Now, still very early, mind you, but there was so much talk of it being from the first century that the reality of it actually ending up being our earliest copy of Mark's Gospel was completely overshadowed by the fact that it wasn't, in fact, from the first century. But you can go back and read about all of that saga on my blog in particular. So the question then is, how do we know that a manuscript is from the 4th century in particular and not from the first? How do we assign these types of dates to these things? So I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago in my answer during the Facebook Live I did when someone asked a question about the early dating of the New Testament documents in their writing. But the how do we know, date manuscripts question answer depends on the type of manuscripts that we have in mind. So, as I said a few weeks back, what papyrologists call documents, that is, receipts, deeds, tax returns, official government documents, those sorts of things, what are also referred to as non literary text, often preserve the dates on which they were copied, just as such types of official documents today still do. And the example I have then was that of Rome and Egypt, where it was common practice to date documents by combining the regional years of emperors with the traditional system of Egyptian months. So a few weeks back, the example I gave was a manuscript called P.AMH 2.78, which is a petition to a centurion detailing complaints against a character named Hecasus Europus. And it carries the date of the year 25th, the 25th year of Marcus Aurelius Commodus Antonius Augustus, say that 5 times fast, Thoth 30, which in terms of the Gregorian calendar that we use today would compute out to September 26th of the year 184 AD. So we can often know the dates of documents like these down to the very day that they were copied. But when we're talking about Christian literature, like Christian manuscripts, the vast majority of the time, if not all of the time, they have no inclusion of such specific dates of composition. And it's only around the 9th century where we start to see some copies of Greek biblical manuscripts, including dates in the form of what are called colophons, which are short notes to the reader from the scribe who copied the manuscript. So the question I want to tackle is how we assign dates to literary papyrus and parchment books from earlier periods. Again, this really depends on the specific manuscripts. It is nearly impossible to be so precise as to know the exact year, or sometimes even the exact decade, that a particular manuscript was copied. But certain features of manuscripts can help to narrow down a window of possible dates. And those who do this kind of stuff within a realm of scholarship are called paleographers. And paleography is the discipline that does analysis and study of comparing handwriting. So, one of the first things that can be done is establishing limits of dates. And by that, what I mean is that different sorts of circumstances can, on occasion, allow us to discern the earliest possible date that a manuscript was copied. And this is what scholars call the terminus post quam, which is a Latin phrase translating to post after which, or the latest possible date at which it was copied. Now, there's also the terminus antiquam, which is the point before which. So we have examples like that of the early martyrdom texts that are set at precise moments when Roman officials who can be cross-referenced are said to have been prosecuting Christians. So I'm thinking of, there's a particular manuscript in the Bodmer collection that includes the Apology of Filius, which recounts the trial of the Bishop Filius under the Roman prefect of Egypt, Claudius Calcianus. And some versions of this text tell us that the event happened in the 21st year of Diocletian, which we can cross-reference and see that the date approximates to 305 AD. So then, the question becomes, how long after Filius was martyred might this particular manuscript have been written? Well, what we have done then is it had to have been sometime after 305 when the event happened. So that gives us the terminus post quam, because obviously manuscripts aren't written before the events they describe. That's pretty clear. And if we circle back to when I was talking about paleographers and what they do, broadly speaking, paleographers study ancient forms of handwriting. So the discipline with Greek paleography includes everything from the earliest examples of recognizing Greek letters carved into stone to the elaborate Greek cursive use that was started to develop during the production of the printing press in Europe. And over time, writing styles shift and change, and certain aspects are more notable in particular time periods. So when it comes to the question of establishing dates for undated manuscripts, documents are put out into groupings of different types of writing styles. And the earliest and latest securely datable examples of each style will provide the range within which the samples of unknown dates can be placed. Because of the presence of more cursive elements in samples, say, of really early documents that show what is called informal round, the establishment of dates for those pieces more frequently involves reference to dated documents with similar types of handwriting. So there's like a compare and contrast going on. And I think all competent paleographers agree on this general approach. But there are differences among them about the degree of chronological precision one can attain from analysis and comparison. But according to a highly influential group of scholars, one can trace with great chronological precision the rise, perfection, and decline of a particular type of writing. And people who do this kind of stuff on the whole believe that they can not only assign an undated manuscript to a general stylistic group, but also to a particular chronological point in the evolution of the style of writing. Also, things like slight differences in formation of letters can indicate geographic differences or competence, age of the person, and inclinations of individual copyists, and therefore not at all indicative of necessarily a relative date. So let me give you a few examples of what I'm talking about that I have just ready here. And there's one here. So on the screen, you should be seeing some Greek text, and this text is what is referred to as angular majuscule. And the text here is a digital rendering of the handwriting employed in the Bacchylides papyrus, which is housed in the British Museum. And right there, you can see in the capital form what says Kurox Passin Isthemon Kalatheon. And if we translate that, it comes out to just now a messenger arrived, having come on the long road from Isthmus. Now, this particular text is noteworthy because the only evidence as to the age of the manuscript is, in fact, the example of the handwriting. So scholars analyzed this text and cross-referenced it with other texts and identified it to the 1st century BC in particular. Here's another one I have queued up. Here's an example from the Gospel of John from the manuscript P66, which is a very influential early manuscript, which is a near complete copy of the Gospel of John from the 2nd or 3rd century. And what I have on the screen is John chapter 8, verses 12 to 14 from P66. And right here, you can see it says, Palin un autois ha Jesus alelese lagon. Then Jesus again spoke to them, saying, and it goes, Ego eimi ta phos to cosmu. I am the light of the world. Ha akulutheon emoi u moi, and so on and so forth. Basically translates that to, he who follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. So let me just show you one or two more examples of this. Here's an interesting one. Here's a section of round informal majuscule from one of the Bodleian collection copies of Homer from the 2nd century. And I'll put it next to a copy of Thucydides in the Peloponnesian War Book 1 in minuscule text. And that text from Thucydides even looks different from this also minuscule text of Herodotus's Histories Book 1. So hopefully what you see there is a different look from the different kinds of text there and what paleographers are dealing with when they look at these kind of things. And obviously I'm giving you extreme examples when a lot of the time it's pretty minute in the details that scholars in this discipline are analyzing. And at this point, there's a database and repertoire that goes with the field. But through analysis and comparison with actual dated documents, it gives us a decent window of time to be able to pinpoint and narrow down some of the dates that we come up with. It's usually about a 50 to 100 year window for undated manuscripts when we're talking about these sort of things. And another way we can date things, along with the evaluation of writing in the field of paleography, is through radiocarbon analysis. So some have critiqued the exact accuracy of paleography due to its window of subjectivity. And radiocarbon dating stands out as being a bit more of a hard dose of hard sciences to the question of dating manuscripts. And while it's true that radiocarbon analysis does provide us with extremely helpful data, it doesn't come up as a magic bullet. So it is important to keep in mind that a radiometric date is expressed not in exact years, but in terms of ranges of years and probabilities. So I am personally not a scientist by any stretch of the imagination. And I'm sure some of my high school teachers, my high school science teachers in particular, will be surprised that any of the next few sentences are going to come out of my mouth. But let me just give you a rundown of how this sort of dating analysis works. So the majority of carbon atoms on the Earth have an atomic weight of 12. But when cosmic rays interact with nitrogen atoms in the upper atmosphere, the unstable radioactive carbon-14 isotope is produced. These isotopes form carbon dioxide molecules and disperse into the lower atmosphere. And during the process of photosynthesis in plants, a small percentage of the carbon dioxide that a plant absorbs contains the carbon 14 isotope. And when animals consume plants, they acquire carbon 14 as well. So this leaves us with the fact that all living things regularly absorb carbon 14 and maintain rough balance with the content of carbon 14 present in the atmosphere until they die. At that point, they cease to acquire new carbon 14. And because carbon 14 decays at a regular rate, decreasing by half every 6,000 years or so, the amount of carbon 14 present in dead organic material functions as a kind of clock, ticking away until the unstable isotope is completely decayed. And scientists then can measure the amount of carbon 14 in a sample and use an equation to determine the age of the material in what they call radiocarbon years. But as I said before, this whole process isn't foolproof, and even the results of radiocarbon dating only give us ranges of possible dates when the animal or plant that the material is used on died. And any date within that window is a probable candidate for the composition. So some have argued that what carbon dating gives you is only a range of the death date of the papyrus plant or the sheep that the vellum is taken from. But realistically, this stuff, it didn't sit very long before it was used as writing material. So at that point, it is a pretty accurate, it is pretty accurate within the windows that were given. A good example of the debate on ranges would be when they were trying to date the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I'm talking about the legitimate ones housed in Israel, not the now clearly forgeries from places like the Museum of the Bible. The ones that are in the Hebrew Museum, because while there was agreement that the originally found Dead Sea Scroll documents came from the Hellenistic and Roman eras, there was disagreement on which decades and centuries we were talking about. So radiocarbon analysis that was done in Zurich in the 1990s, and then a few years later in Arizona, spat out dates between the 1st century AD and the 1st century BC, which didn't necessarily resolve any of the issues and controversies as how much that window that scholars were debating was. But I should point out that the technology that was used then and is used now has taken leaps and bounds in the last 50 years. With the development of accelerator mass spectrometry, which can analyze a small sample, as small as a few fibers taken from the empty margins of a manuscript, has changed things somewhat. So it is a very useful tool, especially when used in conjunction with paleographical findings. It can work to verify some of the windows we have. Now, the third thing I want to talk about, alongside the work of paleographers in radiocarbon dating, is ink analysis. Because the reality is that we can look at the ingredients of the ink used in the documents, and that can also tell us a lot of information. So, for example, in the Roman era, we find a pretty common consensus of black inks being used, made of soot and gum arabic. But in the 3rd and 4th centuries, we see more examples of inks containing metallic compounds. So we can break down the chemical compounds and compare them to manuscripts that are dated and fit the criteria of being in the time they claim to be written. And that can give us good indicators. In fact, in some manuscripts, you can see that the ink appears in places to be almost like a reddish, brownish shade. And that's because of the metallic compounds in the ink that are very so slightly chemically reacting with the paper of over the centuries and actually rusting and changing the tinge of the ink. And once again, like paleography and radiocarbon dating, there's no magic fix-all for ink analysis. So as an example, in early 2013, several news outlets circulated a story stating that ink analysis of the Gospel of Judas was consistent with a date of 280 AD. Now, this immediately stood out to anybody who does manuscript dating because that's an incredibly round number. And realistically, you don't get exact and round numbers for this stuff. You get ranges, you get windows, you get a span of time. And what it turned out to be was that the ink analysis contained soot, a carbon black constituent, and was bound with gum as an adhesive, all corresponding to popular ink ingredients from the 3rd and 4th centuries. So while the ink study did show that the Gospel of Judas was composed in the Roman era, giving a precise date like 280, it was a complete misnomer. And outlets like Fox and National Geographic jumped on it a little presumptuously. So, for those who are still watching and are still awake after all that, my condolences or my congratulations. I don't know which one it is. Basically, what I'm saying is that there are a number of ways we can date manuscripts, biblical or otherwise, and none of them are slam dunks. In some cases, we are lucky enough to have clues that can give us a firm terminus post quam or terminus antiquam. But most of the time, especially with fragmentary Christian manuscripts, we are forced to the conclusions of paleography. And if we're lucky, we cross-reference that investigative work with that of radiocarbon and ink analysis. So all that to say, when you see round dates, be suspicious. They're almost always too convenient, and dating is too complex, and at best, what you should be looking out for is a minimum of 50 years and most 100 years in the windows of the manuscripts dates that you see. Now that brings me to manuscript dating as a concept. Because particularly when it comes to the importance of a date of a manuscript, I know some people who overemphasize earlier dated manuscripts as, say, being more important. And what I mean by that is that the date of a manuscript is obviously important because it can situate that particular manuscript in a proper historical context. Or in some cases, it can require some readjustment of the understanding of some slice of history to account for the presence of a manuscript with that date. But the unfortunate side of all that is that some have played the hand of an early dating to mean more than it actually does. And the whole debacle with the 1st century Mark fragment is a case in point to that fact. So there was so much talk of the tremendous importance of this famed mysterious Mark fragment being 1st century, that when it was later revealed to be from the 3rd century, it didn't matter that it still proved to be our earliest fragment of Mark 1. All of that was overshadowed by the fact that it wasn't from the 1st century, which was the original rumor that it was from the 1st century. But what I really want to capitalize in this section, and then I promise I will release you from your captivity, is that early manuscripts are not always better manuscripts. Now, when we do start to get more confident early dates for biblical manuscripts, sometimes the text of those manuscripts proves to be sloppy, and some later manuscripts turn out to be very well attested. In fact, you have examples like minuscule 1739, which is one of the most frequently cited for Paul and the Catholic epistles. And this particular manuscript is from the 10th century, and we even know who copied it, a scribe by the name of Ephraim, somewhere around the mid 950s. And there are notes in the margins which give us indications that it was based on two or more manuscripts from Caesarea that date at least to the 400s, maybe even earlier. So, in other words, we have documents like minuscule 1739 that, although they're from the 10th century, convey a high quality text found in manuscripts at least 5 centuries earlier. And that particular manuscript isn't necessarily alone in being a manuscript that is later, but clearly shows us an earlier text. So my point in highlighting that is merely to say that earlier doesn't necessarily mean better, and later doesn't necessarily mean worse. Sometimes later manuscripts are better manuscripts, though not always. So there is a caveat to both extremes. And we examine the text within the manuscript itself, what scholars refer to as the internal date, and the clues that we can glean from the text rather than simply the external date, which is the date given by determinations from analyzing the physical material that the text is written on. So a manuscript like minuscule 1739 could have an external date of the 10th century and an internal date in some of its readings from the 5th century. And in one way, those who do textual criticism, i.e., the study of the text and trying to trace it back to its earliest or original wording, care less about the material the text is written on than they do about said text itself. So an external date of the papyrus or parchment or vellum is important, of course, but it's less important to the internal date of the text itself. So I hope that addresses some questions you may, or let's be honest, you may not even have thought about. But now you know. So I wanted to go over that because you see some of these numbers being thrown out, the 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century. How do we come up with these things? Well, paleographic analysis, radiocarbon dating, ink analysis. Those are the main ways that we get to those answers. So I hope this has been educational. I had fun talking about it. I don't always get to talk about these things with too many people, just sit here and vent like that, spew some of the knowledge that's stuck in my head. So thank you for listening. I hope you are all staying safe and healthy out there, and we will catch you next time.